He thought it would be a clean, quiet firing money on the desk, a cold goodbye, and the door clicking shut. But 5 seconds later, the mansion heard something no billionaire can buy: a little boy's barefoot sprint down the driveway, sobbing like his heart was breaking all over again. Every morning at 5 a.m., Denise Walker rode 2 buses from her small place outside the city to the polished estate of tech mogul Graham Caldwell. She cleaned, she cooked, she kept the house running. But more than anything, she held together the world of 4-year-old Eli, a child who had already buried his mother and learned what silence feels like at night. When Eli woke up crying, it was Denise who rocked him. When he asked for Mom, it was Denise who made up silly stories just to get one small laugh. Then Vivian Hart came back, Graham's elegant former flame, all perfume and smiles. Over wine she planted poison, softly. Isn't it strange how close that housekeeper is to you? And to Eli Graham, exhausted and lonely, let fear do the thinking. And on a bitter Tuesday, he called Denise into his office and ended her job with 2 sentences and no eye contact. Denise left with a trembling bag, and Eli watched from the window. The next moment he tore outside, chasing her into the street, screaming her name. When Graham grabbed him, Eli cried into his chest, "You kicked her out! You're mean!" And suddenly Graham realized he hadn't fired a cleaner. He'd ripped out the one person who made his son feel safe. The next few days turned that mansion into a quiet kind of hell. Eli stopped eating, stopped playing. He sat on the floor with his knees pulled tight to his chest, clutching a crumpled drawing stick figures labeled "Me plus Denise." At night, the house didn't sleep. At 2 a.m., 3 a.m., the same small voice cut through the dark. "Dad, where's Denise?" Graham tried everything money could summon. Nannies with perfect resumes, child therapists with calm voices and expensive degrees, educational specialists who promised routines and emotional regulation. None of it touched the raw wound. Eli's grief wasn't a problem to solve. It was a person he was missing. One night, Graham stumbled into Eli's room and found him on the carpet, shaking with quiet sobs, hugging an old blouse Denise had accidentally left behind. The fabric was worn. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and warmth. Eli whispered, barely audible, "She was the only one who cared about me, Dad. The only one." That sentence hit harder than any boardroom betrayal. Graham sank to his knees, his throat tight, tears dropping onto the rug like he'd finally come back to his own life. And that's when Mrs. Loretta Gaines, the longtime housekeeper, who'd seen every season of that family, walked into Graham's office the next morning without knocking. "Sir, I'm speaking," she said, voice steady as steel. Denise stayed up 20 straight nights when Eli had chicken pox. Slept on the floor beside his bed. Used her own paycheck to buy that teddy bear because you were out of town and forgot his birthday. Graham's face drained. Loretta leaned in. "And Vivian was here yesterday. When Eli ran to her, she pushed him away, said he'd dirty her dress." "A dress, sir? More important than your son." Graham's hands clenched. In that moment, the truth snapped into focus. He hadn't protected his family. He'd almost destroyed it. That afternoon, Vivian Hart floated back into the house like nothing had happened, talking about a weekend getaway, fresh air, a reset. She barely glanced toward the hallway where Eli's silence lived. Graham didn't offer her a seat. He stood by the doorway, jaw tight, one hand braced on the back of a chair like he needed something solid. "You did this," he said. Vivian blinked, all lashes and innocence. "Excuse me, you planted fear in my head," Graham snapped. "You made me doubt the one person who kept my son breathing through the night." Vivian's smile thinned. "I was protecting you." "No," he said, voice low. "You were protecting your access to my life." He pointed at the door. "Leave, and don't come back." When she stormed out, the house felt lighter, like someone finally opened a window. Then Graham did something he hadn't done in years. He chose his son over his pride. He drove nearly 120 miles, hands shaking on the wheel, asking strangers in a small town where he could find Denise Walker. A corner store clerk stared at his expensive watch and nodded toward a modest house with flowers in the window. Denise opened the door and her face hardened like a shield. "What do you want, Mr. Caldwell?" "I want 5 minutes," he said. "That's all." Inside the room smelled like warm tea and clean laundry. Nothing fancy, just real. Graham swallowed hard. "I was wrong. I was weak. I listened to poison." His voice cracked. "And I hurt you." Denise crossed her arms, but her eyes shimmered. "You humiliated me." "I know," he whispered. "But Eli, he's not eating. He's not sleeping. He calls your name every night." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking for me. I'm begging for him. Please, just let him see you once, so he knows you're okay." Denise wiped a tear fast, like she was angry at it. "One visit," she said. "That's it." Graham exhaled like he'd been underwater, and for the first time in weeks, he had a way back. 2 days later, the Caldwell mansion didn't look like a showroom anymore. It looked like someone was trying curtains pulled open, fresh flowers on the table. Sunlight finally allowed into the rooms that had been dark for weeks. But Eli still sat on the couch like a tiny statue, shoulders slumped, arms wrapped around that worn teddy bear, as if it was the last safe thing left on earth. Then the front door opened. Soft footsteps, familiar. Denise Walker stepped inside, holding her purse. Close eyes cautious, breathing shallow, like she wasn't sure the floor would hold her. Graham stood back, hands at his sides, letting the moment belong to his son. Eli didn't move at first. He just stared like his brain was afraid to hope. His lip trembled. His fingers tightened around the bear. "Denise," he whispered. Denise swallowed hard. "Hi, baby." That was it. Eli launched off the couch like a rocket, feet slipping on the hardwood, nearly tripping over his own legs. He crashed into her with everything he had, small arms locked around her waist so tight it looked like he was trying to fuse himself to her. "You came back," he sobbed into her shirt. "I knew you would. I asked my mommy in heaven. Every day." Denise dropped to her knees, hugging him back, laughing and crying at the same time. "I'm here," she whispered, pressing kisses into his hair. "I'm right here." Across the room, Graham's eyes filled. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He just watched his son breathe again, watched color return to that little face, and felt the weight of what he'd almost stolen. Denise lifted her chin, finally looking at Graham. Her voice was gentle, but firm. "If I stay," she said, "things change." Graham nodded, throat tight. "Name it." And in that quiet living room with Eli still clinging to her like a lifeline, the rules of that house began to rewrite themselves. The contract Denise asked for wasn't fancy, but it was firm. Paid time off. Sick days. Clear hours. Respect in writing. No family talk when it was convenient, and no cold dismissal when someone got scared. And for the first time in his life, Graham Caldwell didn't negotiate like a CEO. He nodded once. "You're right," he said. "You call the terms." Denise's shoulders loosened a fraction, like she'd been holding her breath for years. She wasn't begging for a job. She was setting a boundary because Eli needed stability, and she needed dignity. Life in the mansion started to move again, but it felt different now. Lighter. Real. Graham began coming home before dark. Not every night, but more nights than ever. He sat at the table and actually ate with his son. He learned how Eli liked his grilled cheese cut triangles, not squares. He read bedtime stories, even when his phone buzzed. And some nights when he heard Eli laughing down the hall with Denise, he didn't feel threatened. He felt grateful. Then it happened quietly at first. A pause in the kitchen when Denise handed him coffee, made exactly how he liked it, without being asked. A look that lasted a second too long. A soft, "You okay, Mr. Caldwell?" that sounded less like an employee and more like someone who truly meant it. Eli noticed everything. Kids always do. One morning he squinted over his cereal and said, dead serious, "Dad, why do you look at Denise like the guys in Grandma's romance books?" Graham nearly choked. Denise turned bright red at the sink, and in that split second between laughter, embarrassment, and the warmth filling the room, Graham realized something terrifying. His fear was gone. And something else was taking its place. Weeks passed, and the house rebuilt itself the only way trust ever comes back, brick by brick. Small things. Quiet things. Graham showing up for dinner without checking his phone. Denise humming while she packed Eli's lunch. Eli sleeping through the night again, finally letting the dark stop winning. But then the calendar flipped to the date Graham hated most. The anniversary. That morning he moved like a ghost. No meetings, no calls. Just the backyard cold air and an old photo in his hands. His late wife smiling like the world hadn't broken yet. Graham sat alone on the garden bench, staring so hard it looked like he could rewind time with his eyes. Behind him, soft footsteps on the stone path. "Mr. Caldwell." Denise's voice was careful. "Can I sit?" He nodded without looking up. She lowered herself beside him, leaving space between them like respect had a physical shape. For a moment, neither spoke. Wind rustled the trees. Somewhere inside, Eli laughed at a cartoon, and the sound stabbed and healed at the same time. "I'll never forget her," Graham finally said, voice rough. "She was the great love of my life." Denise didn't flinch. She didn't compete with a memory. She simply said, "You shouldn't forget her. She gave you Eli. She'll always be part of your family." Graham turned to her, then really turned. His eyes were wet. "And you brought light back into this house," he whispered. "You brought life. You brought love." His breath caught. "And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you, Denise." Denise's hand flew to her mouth. Tears gathered fast. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Scared to get hurt again." Graham nodded, voice shaking. "Me too. But I think it's worth risking together." And on that bench, under the same sky that once felt empty, the future cracked open, quiet, terrifying, and full of hope. The morning of Eli's birthday arrived with the kind of quiet that feels suspicious in a big house. The sun wasn't even fully up, and yet the kitchen smelled like toast slightly burned and orange juice slightly spilled. If you listened closely, you could hear tiny feet shuffling and a grown man whispering, "Careful, careful," like he was diffusing a bomb. Denise stepped downstairs and froze. Construction paper banners hung crooked across the doorway. Hand-drawn balloons. A lopsided heart. The table looked like a breakfast surprise designed by a 4-year-old. Because it was. Eli stood on a chair, chest puffed out, hair sticking up like he'd fought a pillow and lost. "Surprise!" he yelled, throwing his arms wide. Denise laughed, then her eyes stung. "What is all this, baby?" Eli grabbed her hand with both of his, suddenly serious, in a way that made the room go still. He looked up at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered into the dark. "Denise," he said, voice shaking, "you can stay forever. You can be my mom forever." The air tightened. Even the refrigerator hum sounded loud. Graham stepped forward, slow, careful, like one wrong move might crack the moment. His voice was low. "He's right," he said. "We want you here, not as staff, as family." He swallowed hard. "As my wife, and Eli's mother. If you want that." Denise stared at them, this man, who finally learned to be present, this child, who taught him what love looks like. Her tears fell anyway. "I'll say yes," she whispered. "On one condition." She pointed gently between them. "You never make me feel disposable again." Graham nodded. "Never." Eli bounced. "Never," he shouted, wrapping his arms around her. And right then, a small white butterfly drifted in through the open window, circled them once, twice, then slipped back into the morning light. The kitchen stayed messy crumbs on the counter, a paper banner slipping off the wall, but the air felt different, like the house itself had exhaled. Denise held Eli close, his cheek pressed to her shoulder, and Graham stood there with his hands half raised, unsure if he'd earned the right to join the hug. Then Denise reached out and tugged him in. Just like that, the three of them became one shape in the middle of that bright, imperfect room. Behind the doorway, Mrs. Loretta Gaines wiped her eyes fast, pretending she hadn't been watching. She'd seen rich families come and go. She'd seen promises made and broken. But this was the rare kind of moment that didn't need money to feel expensive. Graham's voice cracked against Denise's hair. "Thank you," he whispered. Not to her, not only. Something higher, something he couldn't explain. The same second that White Butterfly drifted past the window again, catching the sunlight like a tiny blessing, then disappeared into the blue. Eli pulled back and looked between them, proud, like he'd just fixed the whole world. "We're a real family now," he declared, as if saying it made it official. Denise kissed his forehead. "Yeah, baby," she murmured. "A real one." And Graham, this man who used to measure life in stock prices and schedules, finally measured it in something else. Laughter at the table. Warm hands in his. A child who no longer cried for someone missing. Not the traditional way, not the expected way, but the truest way, a family chosen by love, and held together by the courage to start again. And if you're still here right now, don't scroll, because this is the part that stays with you. A week later, the Caldwell house didn't feel like a museum anymore. It sounded like life. Eli's laughter bounced off the walls. Denise's voice floated from the kitchen, steady, warm, real. And Graham. He stopped treating love like a risk on a spreadsheet. He treated it like oxygen. There were still hard moments. Grief doesn't vanish just because joy returns. Some nights, Eli would stare at the stars and whisper, "Do you think my first mommy can see us?" Denise would pull him close and say, "I know she can." Graham would sit beside them silent, finally learning that being a father isn't about fixing every feeling. It's about staying present inside it. One evening, as the porch light flickered on, Graham looked at Denise and said, "I used to think I had everything." He shook his head. "I didn't even have my own son." Denise didn't lecture him. She just squeezed his hand like, "We're here now. That's what matters." And here's what I want you to take from this. The biggest regrets don't come from what we couldn't buy. They come from who we pushed away when we were afraid. So tell me, what city are you watching from tonight? And if this story touched something in you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to come home. That night, after Eli finally drifted off, one small hand still curled around Denise's finger, Graham stood in the hallway and stared at the closed bedroom door like it was the entrance to a life he almost lost. The mansion was quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. It felt held. He walked back to the kitchen where the birthday banner still hung crooked, and Denise was folding napkins like she needed something simple to do with her hands. Graham cleared his throat. "I need to say this out loud," he murmured. Denise didn't look up. "Then say it. I was a man who had every security system money could buy," he said, voice low, "and I still let fear walk right into my home and take control." He swallowed. "I treated you like you were replaceable." Denise's fingers paused. The room tightened. Graham stepped closer, not rushing, not demanding. "I can't undo what I did," he said, "but I can spend the rest of my life proving you're safe here." He held up his hand, no ring yet, just a promise in the open air. "Not as help, not as a convenient solution, as my wife, as the person Eli chose with his whole heart." Denise finally met his eyes. There was pain there, but there was also a quiet strength. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," she said softly. "I'm trying to build something true," Graham nodded. "That's all I want." From down the hall, Eli's sleepy voice called out, "Mom," Denise answered without thinking. "I'm here, baby," and Graham, eyes shining, whispered like a prayer. "Yeah, we're here." The next morning didn't feel like a fairy tale. It felt like real life, quiet, imperfect, and finally honest. Graham made breakfast himself. Not because a camera was watching, not because he wanted applause, because he wanted Eli to wake up and see his dad still there. Still trying. Denise sat at the table with a mug of coffee, watching him fumble with the spatula, like a man learning a new language. Eli padded in, rubbing his eyes. He saw Denise first and smiled, small, sleepy, safe. Then he looked at Graham and whispered, "You're not leaving today, right?" Graham crouched down so their faces were level. "Not today," he said, "and not tomorrow either. I'm building my life here." Eli stared, studying his father like he was searching for cracks. Then he nodded once, like a tiny judge granting parole. Okay. Later that week, Graham did something that surprised everyone, especially himself. He called his board and canceled 2 trips. He delegated. He stopped acting like the world would collapse if he wasn't holding it by the throat. Because the truth was, his world had almost collapsed when he let Denise walk out the front door. One evening, Denise found a framed photo on the mantel, Eli between them, all 3 laughing, the kitchen behind them, still a mess. Under it was a simple note in Graham's handwriting. "Presence is the new wealth." Denise traced the words with her thumb, eyes wet. In the hallway, Eli's voice floated out, bright and certain. "Mom, Dad, come see." And they did together, because this time nobody was left behind. By the time spring rolled in, the Caldwell house had a rhythm you could almost hear, like a steady heartbeat instead of a countdown. Graham learned the small things first. He learned that home by 6:30 mattered more than any late-night email. He learned that Eli's nightmares didn't need solutions, just a warm light in the hallway and a calm voice saying, "I'm here." And he learned that Denise didn't need grand speeches. She needed consistency. Then came the day they didn't post about. No press, no headlines. Just a simple backyard ceremony under a white canopy, the kind you'd see in a quiet American neighborhood where people bring folding chairs and lemonade. Loretta stood near the front, tissue in hand, pretending she wasn't crying. Eli wore a little suit and carried the rings in a small box, gripping it like it was the most important job on earth. Before the vows, Graham walked to a small table with a framed photo of Eli's first mother, a single rose beside it. He touched the frame gently. No drama, no denial, just respect. Denise watched him, and you could see it in her face. This wasn't replacement. This was healing. When Graham said, "I choose you," his voice shook. When Denise said, "I'm staying," it landed like a promise carved into stone. Eli burst into applause like he was running the whole show. And later that night, as porch lights blinked on and the last guest hugged goodbye, Eli leaned into Denise and whispered, "We did it." Yeah, kid, they did. If this story hit you somewhere deep, hit like subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let love back in. On the first Monday after the wedding, nothing dramatic happened. And that's exactly why it mattered. The coffee brewed. The lunchbox snapped shut. The school bus groaned at the curb. Denise Caldwell adjusted Eli's collar while Graham hunted for a missing shoe, laughing at himself like a man who finally understood what rich really means. Eli paused at the front steps and looked back at them both. Not scared, not bracing for goodbye, just calm. "See you after school," he said. Like it was the most normal thing in the world. Denise waved. Graham waved. And when the bus pulled away, Graham didn't rush to his office. He stayed on the porch with Denise, letting the quiet settle. Because for years, quiet meant loneliness. Now it meant peace. He took her hand. "We almost missed this," he whispered. Denise squeezed back, but we didn't. Inside the house still held the past with respect. A photo on the mantel, a rose beside it, but it no longer lived in grief. It lived in love that showed up. Every day. In small, steady ways. Sometimes the most expensive mistake isn't a bad investment. It's pushing away the person who makes your home feel safe, because you listened to fear instead of truth. If you're lucky enough to still have time, don't wait for a crisis to become present. Make the call. Say the thank you. Fix what you can while you still can. Now tell me in the comments, Who in your life has been your Denise? The person who loved you when it wasn't their job. And if this story touched something in you, subscribe for more true-to-life, heart-grabbing stories and hit like, so this message reaches someone who needs it tonight.